Okay, the recording has started. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today is April the 1st, 2014, and this is a public webinar from the IBM DevOps Community. My name is Jean-Louis Maréchaux from IBM Rational, and I'm glad to host this session about the Scaled Agile Framework. To cover this topic today, we've got special guests, special speakers from SAFE. So Dean Leffingwell, Chief Methodologist and creator of the Scaled Agile Framework, and Jennifer Fawcett, VP at Scaled Agile Academy. Dean, Jennifer, welcome to the call.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This call is being recorded, so if you object, you may disconnect now. The presentation materials and recording and additional links will be available from the DevOps community in the next 24 hours. So when you need to access the recording, on slide number 2, you've got a link to the DevOps community, and I will post the different links in the chat window as well. The community is the place to access the forums, blogs, the different events, and also share your stories on DevOps adoption. There's also a special subset of the DevOps community that we call the Agile Learning Circle. So it's accessible from the community itself, but also there's a direct link to the Agile Learning Circle. And this is a place to learn on Agile methodologies. And soon we will have a special learning roadmap on SAFE. So you can visit the link that is on page 2, and you will be able to access material on SAFE. After the live webinar, you can go back to the community. You can also go back to the blog entry related to this special webinar. So this is the link, the second link on page number 3. You can post comments, ask questions, and this is where we will post the recording and the presentation material, or links to the material. There's also a link to access the different DevOps events, so feel free to register to the different upcoming events. And the next one will be on agility and integration when you've got multiple tools from multiple vendors. So if you need to register, you've got a link on that. With that, Dean, Jennifer, if you're ready to go, Dean, I will make you presenter right now.
Okay.
Fantastic. And while we're doing that transition, I'd just like to introduce Dean and talk about what we're going to discuss today. So we're going to give you about a 45-minute presentation on foundations of the Scaled Agile Framework: scale up, stay lean, and have fun. So what you'll learn are some of the principles of the Scaled Agile Framework, how we apply Lean and Agile at scale, and really how we apply the principles of product development flow to doing software development in the enterprise. So let me talk a little bit about Dean. Had the pleasure of working with him for almost the past 20 years, but he's been doing this for about 40 years now. He's the creator of the framework.
40
years, yeah, he's a little grayer than myself. He is a world-renowned author. He's got some great books out there: Managing Software Requirements, Scaling Software Agility, and most recently, Agile Software Requirements, which was really kind of the preface for the Scaled Agile Framework. If you have that book, you can open up the front cover and you can see kind of the beginnings of the framework. He started his career a long time ago doing software development in the medical industry, software and hardware development in the medical industry. And what he learned was, when you're doing software development in the medical industry, if you don't manage your requirements effectively, people die. So that was a pretty big learning, and he took that learning and he took the term requirements management and actually coined that in the software development lifecycle. So a little company called Requisite was purchased by a pretty large company, Rational Software. I'm sure you guys are pretty familiar with Rational.
Somebody bought Rational too. I can't remember who.
I can't remember who that was. And then from there was a senior VP, business unit manager for Rational University, and responsible for the Rational Unified Process and the UML as well. So pretty honored and proud to be working with him and myself. I've pretty much been a practitioner of software development for the past 30 years, not quite as gray as Dean, but I'm getting there. And quite recently, I've joined Scaled Agile, been with us for about the past year and a half, and running the Scaled Agile Academy, which is really the professional education and certifying agency for the Scaled Agile Framework courseware and curriculum. When I'm not doing that here in the office and delivering webinars with Dean, I'm helping Fortune 500s deliver Agile release trains, which is really the continuous value stream for delivering software at scale. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dean.
Thanks. I assume you can see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Good, great. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk a little bit about SAFE. I'm going to have a bit of a monologue here for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. The title of the talk is Safe Foundations, Be Agile, Scale Up, and Stay Lean. I think that's kind of self-explanatory as why we want to do those things, but also have a little more fun. I think one of the things that has so intrigued me about the Agile movement is, frankly, it's just more fun to write software as part of an Agile team than in our traditional model, and fun is part of our intrinsic motivation in life. So I always like to share a few stories about increases in employee engagement and fun results. Many of us are taught as coaches, and one of the things we learn as coaches is asking powerful questions. And one of the most powerful questions is, what brings you to this inquiry? Why do we care? Why are we talking about SAFE? And I think the reason we're talking about SAFE is pretty obvious to all of us. I like to blame it on Gordon Moore and his dang Moore's Law, which doubled the processing power at basically the same cost every year for the last 20 years or 25 years, and absolutely did that. So we have computing capability that we couldn't even envision. 4 or 5 years ago, I was a CEO of a search company. I remember the servers that we bought were unbelievable, half a terabyte of disk drive, 8 gigabyte of RAM, and they were $1,500, just unimaginable computing power. And our brains have unlimited imagination as well, so we can invent lots of things. I sit here looking at products and services that we're offering, and I can invent many more times than what we can do. But our methods, frankly, haven't kept pace. So our methods are still relatively behind the times. And while we did good work, I think in iterative incremental development, I'm actually quite proud of the years I spent at Rational, helping people get unaddicted to waterfall. We run into those shops every day, and frankly, they have less trouble than their waterfall predecessors. Agile was invented for small teams, works great, but guess what? It was invented for small teams, and those that invented it said it's not even intended to scale. It's not our goal to scale it. So that brings us to a slightly different paradigm, and we talked a little bit about longevity here, my kind of fourth decade in this process. And for those of you who have been around this for a while, I'll bet you'll agree with me that we didn't think it would be this way now. I thought we'd be sitting at most amazingly powerful CAD stations, which we have, using amazingly powerful languages, which we generally have, using well-formed UML drawings and semantically provable state machines and wireframes and dragging and dropping and building applications at a level of abstraction 2 or 3 times where we are. Well, that we don't have. What we have oftentimes feels a lot more like this. And we may look at these folks and go, boy, that looks like a pretty manual process. But even then, at least they're co-located, right? We run in organizations every day that have basically a similar manual process, although it's not typing, obviously. And these people at least have the advantage of co-location. So frankly, we haven't been able to keep up, and it's time to make the next step in our evolution. But whenever I talk to people about SAFE, I like to remind them of their options. We're all free. We can develop whatever methods and practices we want, and we still have a choice. And the choice up top is still chosen a lot, and in many environments for a number of reasons: high assurance, systems decomposition, outsourcing and procurement, various types of standards, implementations through waterfall, SDLCs owned by customers and vendors. The top is still a choice, but it's not the best choice, as we know, and it creates challenges. And this is the simplest slide I've ever found. Actually, Drew created this slide, and I just stole it, and realized that our choice is to at the end, or build a little box now, and add to that box, and add to that box, and add to that box, and add to that box. And when people look at this and start to realize that, wow, that's a pretty important choice, you ask them a question: would you rather really have a big box much later, or a little box right away? And that kind of, I think, crispens the discussion around why it is what we do. And the interesting thing about those little boxes is that they stay, they persist, they ship, they get deployed, they get used, and then the next box add to it. And over time, what you see is this accumulation of value that the prior diagram doesn't really give you. So even if all other things were equal, if you perfectly executed a waterfall program, or you perfectly executed the same program in Agile, you have a dramatic difference in economic outcomes, even if they were both perfectly executed. And that's what drives us to this model. What drives us to this model is simply economics. We do a better job if we have more value early, and that value integrates over time. In addition, we know that in the end, in our world, your world, my world, everything becomes commoditized. Every feature. I mean, IBM doesn't make laptops anymore, right? Because that became commoditized too. So commoditization is a tough thing because it moves the value proposition to the low-cost producer rather than the innovators. Well, we want to be on the innovation side, and what this slide purports to say is that as those little pieces of value are maturing, they're maturing at a time when each piece is worth a lot. I remember my first iPhone. I remember working for other companies that were making fun of that iPhone. They said it doesn't do video, there's no app store, there's no GPS, look at the camera, what a silly camera. And those companies today are also ran in the iPhone business because the value of what Apple was able to do in that first iPhone in 2007 was extraordinary compared to its actual capability. It wasn't much of a phone, but it was an incredible office in a pocket. And an office in a pocket was worth a lot to me, and I paid a lot for my iPhone for the privilege. So we just have to recognize that early is good, right? The earlier you are, so long as the quality is there, the more value you're going to achieve in the market. So that's the simple economic model. Now, I'm sure many of you hang around and watch forums and blogs and even maybe are entertained by some of the grand debates about Agile methods, but I would like to provide our perspective, my perspective. And my perspective is that we are dealing right now with really one of the greatest challenges we've ever known. We're building systems of extraordinary complexity. You can't drive a car down the freeway or ride an elevator or get a paycheck without software involvement. So I believe that we can and should use every tool at our disposal, and our responsibility is to understand what those tools are. So if I see somebody talking about Scrum, I'm supportive because Scrum works. Less filling, right? Tastes great. Ubiquitous. Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org, 100,000 Scrum Masters out there, hundreds and hundreds of certified Scrum trainers. We can leverage that. Sprinting is great. Sprinting does a small amount of work in a time box that manages WIP, creates a deadline, focuses the attention. Extreme programming, for those of you who have been thinking about this a dozen or so years ago, will remember that there was once a battle between the Scrum and the extreme programming people. And that's kind of an interesting battle when you think about it, because when you go to a Scrum class, many of you are certified Scrum Masters, I'm sure, there's no code involved. Nobody ever sees a line of code at a Scrum class. But if you go to an XP class, I guarantee you that code is looked at. So extreme programming really isn't about the software process, other than about the process of creating code. Scrum is really a software project management process, and it doesn't even have to use for software. It just happens to be quite effective for software. Well, extreme programming is extremely useful. I mean, what's wrong with pairing? What's wrong with collective ownership and coding standards and unit testing and test-driven development and test automation and monitoring build activity? Nothing's wrong with it. It's great. So Scrum and extreme programming are not at opposite ends of the spectrum. They actually do different things. And the recent move to Kanban, I also appreciate. I have personally a pretty substantial background in Lean. Actually came from some part of me has a Lean manufacturing background, and Kanban is focused on understanding the way work works, right? Kanban makes work visible. It helps you manage demand and limit work in process. So why, if I was building big software, wouldn't I potentially apply Scrum for project management? Take very careful practices from extreme programming, produce code quality, and also understand flow. These are not unlike thoughts. We are not stupid people. We don't have to be in a camp that says Kanban is good and there are no deadlines. Scrum has deadlines, Kanban doesn't. Scrum is better. They're all good, but they don't quite do it, do they? They weren't designed. I mean, I would say Kanban might be an exception to this rule, which is Kanban certainly has applications above the team level. But when we talk about scaling XP, for example, well, how do you scale that above the team? Well, you don't. They're not writing code above the team. Okay? So consequently, if those methods don't have the native constructs they need to scale, should we then be prohibited from getting some of those same benefits in the larger enterprise? And what's more, some of the interesting discussions I see, in the blogosphere about that make me wonder sometimes if some of the folks that have invented some of these methods really think the people that say, for example, Lockheed Martin are supposed to have fun. Maybe they're not supposed to. Maybe they work in a big enterprise and it shouldn't be as cool. But I don't believe that. I believe that every practitioner should have the option to be part of an Agile team and be part of a high-performing team. So it's more than an opportunity. I think it's an imperative. I think we have an obligation to bring the best practices to every practitioner out there. And that's what motivates me. And because it works, and motivates me, you have another choice. Another stark choice, if you will. You can scale yourself. By the way, many of the Agilists out there think this is the right approach. Every company is different. We completely agree. Every company is different. Every application is different. So you can grow your own. But it takes time, and why would you reinvent the patterns that have already been determined? So our suggestion, and the suggestion is being well received by the market, is to start with a framework, something that's been proven to work. And the framework is not a thing that was invented at a desk. It was a thing that was basically harvested from the field. In particular, 2006, 2007, we took our down and dirty XP and Scrum methods to companies like BMC Corporation, where we had a green field, and we said, let's try it. And we tried sprinting and applying XP, and it worked, but we hit obstacles immediately. So over the last, 6-7 years, we've been harvesting these best practices from great companies and recording them as such. In so doing, the framework cares a lot about four things. I won't go into any depth on any of them, but I'll at least mention them. Number one is code quality matters. You can't scale crappy code. So we don't roll out the framework and then come back 2 years later and say, okay, let's look at some of this cool stuff that extreme programming taught us. It's all one. Companies struggle with program execution. And if I give this talk in a plenary session, I'll say, how many people are here? Raise your hands if you're involved in a large software program. And many do. And I say, and how many, keep your hand up if that's going really, really well. Okay? And all the hands go down. And the reason is we don't really know how to do that. And that's the primary focus. And that's where SAFE was born, was helping groups of between 50 and 300 people build great applications. Briefly, but I won't go into any further other than to say that what we need is trust. SAFE is not contra to the Agile Manifesto. It's built on it. SAFE assumes the manifesto scales. And if you go back and read it, it does scale. Okay? Some of the methods that are employed may or may not scale natively, but the principles themselves do scale. Now, as soon as you leave the boundary of the team, however, you start to have a different problem, which is what body of knowledge do you have to talk to, let's just say, a PMO in a large organization? And, those are almost fighting words. PMO, doesn't that mean governance, and doesn't that mean regulation? And aren't those isn't that the place where all the SDLC impediments come from? Well, maybe. It's also the place where the analysis happens. It's also the place where the funding flows through. It's the place where our strategy is allocated into programs, et cetera. But if you want to talk to those folks about scaling Agile methods, you don't have much in your XP bag of tricks. They don't care about how you cut the code or whether you have a daily stand-up, and you need a much, much broader body of work. And for me, that body of work is Lean and product development flow. So I'm going to spend about 5 or 8 minutes just kind of describing that context, because this really informs everything we do. As we scale, we have the manifesto in one hand, we have Lean and principles of product development flow in the other, speaking metaphorically, of course, and then we think about, is this next thing we're going to do consistent with those? And if it is, we'll give it a shot. The House of Lean is the way we like to think about the big picture of Lean, and there we see the goal, respect for people. People are part of Lean as part of the manifesto. Product development flow, Kaizen or continuous improvement. But you also notice a foundation, and that foundation is leadership, and I will return to that in a while because that's a fundamental difference between Lean thinking and Agile development. Agile was invented for and deployed and is designed for teams, and we love those teams. They create all the code. Lean is really delivered by, taught by, and mentored by leadership, and therefore we have a different responsibility in Lean than we do in Agile development. The goal, sustainably shortest lead time. If we have this conversation with folks above us, program managers, product managers, system architects, enterprise architects, CEOs, CIOs, CFOs, and we say, why are we doing this significant change initiative called bringing in SAFe or Scaled Agile? The answer is we're looking for the sustainably shortest lead time with best quality and value to people, society. And as you parse this a little further, you start to understand that we're mostly late. And we're late because there are delays. And if you attack the delays, not necessarily the traditional view of lean waste, which is stuff that you're doing you shouldn't need to do or stuff you create you don't want, but the notion of handoffs and delays, you'll recognize that there's some real low-hanging fruit because nobody is defending the delays. So if you address the delays, you have a short course in addressing lean. And then also, Ryan Inson's work, Principles of Product Development Flow, I think is the strongest. It's the key influence we have right now. It is the thing that I believe starts to separate the next generation of software development practitioners, values, and principles from the last, which is we now understand that there's a number of key principles that apply no matter whether we're building an HP disk drive or a Battleship or a BMC Performance Manager piece of software. And you can read these here. I'm going to talk about one or two, but they are take an economic view, actively manage queues, understand and exploit variability, reduce batch sizes, apply work and process constraints, control flow under uncertainty using cadence and synchronization, get feedback as fast as possible, and decentralize control. All of those words are pretty new in our world. And our software teams don't necessarily think about queues or variability and how they need to, and how it can affect them both badly and positively. And they don't think about batch sizes and other elements as well. I included this one slide from some of our lean training because the curve on the lower left is a really valuable curve. What that curve says, and that's from Poppendiek's work, by the way, says is that the larger the batch size, and the higher the utilization of the system that is addressing that batch size, the higher the variability in result. And large batch sizes increase variability, and high utilization increases variability, and the result naturally is severe project slippage. In other words, it's the most likely result. Resources are busy, the batch is very big, you will have variability. All of our large software programs have variability. It's not positive variability, it's negative variability. So is it because we work with people who fundamentally don't know how to plan or write software, or is it because we've taken systemically the wrong approach, an approach that says, oh, let's figure out all the requirements. That's a big batch. Let's hand it off to code. Okay, that's a big batch. Let's hand it off to test. Everybody is busier than heck. We have fundamentally designed a system that it creates inherent variability. We also have to start to understand work in process and being able to visualize that. And that's a thing that Kanban and Lean are really, really keen on. If you can't see it, it's probably going to hurt you. And since our work is intellectual property, you almost certainly have far too much of it. So I throw this slide in as a little as a teaser to kind of illustrate some of the differences between, kind of Kanban, Scrum, work in process visibility, and a traditional model, which would have some other form of status report. And I can look at this and give yourself, I'll give a 10-second pause here and ask yourself a question. How is this team doing? Tick-tock. Tick-tock. Well, I can't hear you, but you know they're not doing very well. And how do you know that? Because they visualize their work, and because they actually know what their time box is, and because their work moves through various stages. And I want to ask another question. If instead that team had imposed a 3-story work in process constraint on the stages of development and test, what would the behavior be? I'll give you another 15-second pause to think about that. What would they do if you could only have 3 stories in development and test? I'll short circuit it. What would a developer do if he finished story 8? He'd go get story 9. What if there's a 3-story work in process limit on development? He can't get story 9. His choice is to go help test. If he helps test, he may feel slightly suboptimized. Maybe he's a Java dev, and yet the throughput of the system goes up. So this is a slide that I use to kind of point out why we need to start thinking about work differently and understanding the work that flows through the system, because as professionals, if we don't understand the work, it's no wonder that we get outcomes that we weren't expecting.
That was a great exercise, Dean. So they actually did answer.
Oh, you're kidding.
They did. They said, well, they'll have to finish the story sooner. We'll have great benefit out of that, and then they'll help the other devs get work.
Absolutely, absolutely. And all because we took the time to, A, create objects for the work, understand where the objects were in process, create a simple kind of Kanban state machine, and know what today is. So very simply done and yet extremely powerful. So this expresses this abstract notion of work in process, limit work in process. Go talk to the PMO about that, or the VPs and the product managers. They don't get that necessarily. They're going, I want as much work in process as possible. Well, do you really? And this is part of the transition that we have to make in the minds of all of us managers. I think Deming said the workers will do their best no matter what system they're in. Only managers can change the system. This is a system. A manager can understand that and implement that. I've never done an exercise in a webinar before, Jennifer, but I've never had you here.
Well done.
Okay. Let's look at the framework. Let's start with the first assumption. I hope you can appreciate this. Maybe you can't. It got blasted the other day. Somebody put up a picture of, so it wasn't me, they did a presentation of SAFE at a Scrum gathering, and they got blasted, and they said, oh my goodness, Scrum is just one little box in the lower left corner of the diagram, so it can't be very agile if Scrum is that small. Well, come on, okay? Lots of great Scrum teams out there, and boy, do we need them. They can, by the way, they can also run Kanban or Scrumban within certain constraints of planning and dependency management. But these are empowered, self-organizing, self-managing, cross-functional teams, and we really mean it, right? This is not, every executive says their teams are empowered. These have to be empowered. Why? Because we want to go fast, and because we want the maximum amount of flexibility to demand. Well, you can't manage that, right? You can't be redispatching teams or saying, hey, your backlog isn't right. They still ship software every 2 weeks. That's kind of the sweet spot now. Scrum started out with a 30-week sprint. Now it's a 2-week sprint. Software Scrum project management practice and XP-inspired technical practices. However, our teams operate under program vision, system and architecture, and user experience guidance. And of course, there's far more to the story. This is a whole level, not a single slide. We use user stories because they do, and because it's a brilliant little invention. And Jennifer talked about my work in requirements management. I was asleep the day I should have invented user stories because they're a really cool token. They force understanding and alignment between the developer and the user, even if that user is a system or device. So we love user stories. They came from XP. They're largely taught in Scrum now. We certainly teach them and use them as well. But you can't scale crappy code. So these 6 practices on the left are part of SAFE. This is part of our training. So if you take a SAFE, we call it SAFE Scrum XP class, you're going to learn about Agile Architecture and continuous integration and test first and refactoring and why it's important and patterns for that. And pair work. We don't call it pair programming. That's a bridge too far for many. But if I ask a different question, how many of you that are working on large systems would be comfortable if a developer put a piece of code into the system that nobody else had ever seen? I think the answer is none of us would be very comfortable with that. It's not quite the same as pair programming. It was pretty important. And collective ownership, because collective ownership is a key facilitator of speed. So that's a very fast overview of the team level. But guess what? We're building big systems, and there's actually 2 systems at work here. And what we know, we've always known this, at least from Deming's days, is that systems don't manage themselves. Left to themselves, components become selfish, competitive, independent profit centers, and thus destroy the system. And there's 2 interesting systems at work here. There's the subject system, the system we're building, and the components of that system will become selfish, right, unless that's managed. And there's the enterprise system itself that builds that. So that team or that program will also become selfish unless we as managers have a role in optimizing that. So the secret is cooperation between components towards the aim of the organization, and therefore the program requires a little extra thought. So the program, I used to have a slide in here which I've taken out that just illustrated that the program has exactly the same pattern as a sprint. A bunch of teams plan together, commit together, execute together, and inspect and adapt together. And they do that in 2-week sprints based upon a common cadence, and they do that in these larger time boxes that we currently call PSIs, basically program increments, potentially shippable increments. And that larger time box is a strategic time box because there's enough time has elapsed, enough value has been built that the right types of stakeholders can get involved in that. But here we change the description from user stories, which are small. They fit in sprints, right? So how many user stories are in a PSI? Many. Okay, our value description here moves to features and benefits, which is a much more natural discussion. Not a well-received discussion necessarily by those in the Scrum community who don't use the word features, but we do. So be it. And in order to make that work, synchronization matters. When in our lean trainings, we talk a lot about cadence and synchronization. They're the tools we use to manage the inherent variability in R&D. And so these teams are aligned. And we align them for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that we can do system continuous integration. If you go into your large client base as now or maybe internal IBM and you say, do you have continuous integration? The answer is probably yeah. But if you say at the system level, well, what do you mean by that? I mean every 2 weeks, can you demo all the new code end-to-end that's been developed by every team on that program in every system, component, and subsystem? And the answer is usually not. Well, that's not okay because that's where we really need our fast feedback. So we synchronize those teams to assure delivery, and rarely is that much of a discussion at all because they know that. They know they need to do that. And then the top portion of this picture, what you see here, is that the goal was never to have the team sprint, right? I mean, that's not a bad goal. The teams do their daily stand-ups and they work in short time boxes and they agree and they inspect that. That's a pretty good goal. But why did we have them do that? We had them to do that because they were building better systems. And the goal is to have the system sprint. And the system isn't sprinting if the teams are sprinting but continuous integration doesn't happen. So we're real keen on that system demo, the little yellow box there that appears in the big picture. And we coach our release trains to do that. But before we leave the topic, I would like to make one other point, which is the big picture tends to infer something that it doesn't really mean to infer. And it tends to infer that those kind of big yellow things are the release boxes. And for most enterprises, they are. Even Salesforce now has a cadence of releases that's every 8 weeks. But that's not the goal, right? The goal is to have the the development teams use cadence and synchronization to help them manage inherent variability and align their work and to get fast feedback and to make sure that they're communicating effectively and the system is working. But delivery is a different thing. So we call that develop on cadence and deliver on demand. And deliver on demand might be, daily or 5 times a day, or deliver on demand might be only every 6 months. I was talking to a big bank the other day, and they have this massive application that they're trying to deploy across every region. Well, I'm quite confident that they have no ability to deliver every day a subset of that system across all those countries. Each of those countries is a custom instance, but they certainly can have a cadence for that, or maybe, but that cadence is independent of the development cadence. So an important point: don't be misled by the big picture. This is going to be fixed in 3.0 this summer. I think it will be a lot less confusing. And when I say 3.0, what do I mean? I mean that SAFE was launched at 1.0 2 years ago. It's now version 3. It's not fixed. It's changing. It's changing because we learn new things every day. One key element of SAFE is cadence-based, cross-functional, face-to-face planning. And what you see here in this picture is a typical, I'd say large end, but typical face-to-face planning session. This one involves about 150 practitioners in 3 countries. There's a large team in Mumbai. They're still in Mumbai. So when we say face-to-face, what we mean is really contemporaneous planning. 15 or 20 people from Kosice, Serbia are here. Their teams did not come. We couldn't afford that, but the leads were here. And then all the development teams in the U.S. were here, and we planned for basically 2 days or a little over 2 days. This is a cathartic process that's really exciting. It energizes the teams because one of the most important things about Agile is the handoff of empowerment, authority, and responsibility. The plans come from the teams. The program schedules come from the teams. They create them. We honor them. And because they created them, then they're really, really motivated to make that happen. So what you see here is how that happens in a really large scale. And this is integral to SAFE. If you're not doing this type of release planning on a cadence, you're not practicing SAFE. You may have some good benefits that you're getting out of SAFE, but you're not getting the full benefits. And most of our enterprises are quite immature when it comes to DevOps. I know this is a community of practice that may see companies every day pushing small batches into deployment with feature toggles that get turned on at the right moment. That's mostly not our universe. Most of our universe is people building big assets that initially they build the asset faster and they can't get it deployed. But we understand that that's the goal, and we understand that the value only occurs when the end users are successfully operating that stuff. So we have guidance for DevOps as well. But keep in mind that in terms of level of maturity, this is one icon out of 60 or so in the big picture, and it's one article. So this is really a placeholder for our tips that we teach in SAFE as to start thinking about with this thing called the deployment pipeline, and what numbers and types of staging and test environments you need to have, and how you need to have everything under version control, and how those runbooks can and should be fully automated. So this is our, I wouldn't call it a placeholder. I would say this is our entry point for a longer-term discussion. As our market evolves, SAFE will evolve with it, and frankly, we'd be open for help down this path in terms of how we evolve DevOps over time. And next to last, we're not done. And the reason we're not done is that we're operating within the context of an enterprise, let's say a business unit. Maybe it's John Deere Intelligent Systems Group, and they have 400 or 500 people, probably twice to that now. One of the problems with success, by the way, is people give you more resources, and then you have to scale even more. I've been at 3 or 4 places in the last couple of years where they're wide-eyed. They're going, that was really fun, and we did great, and now our budget has been doubled because we're performing so much better. How are we going to do it twice as big? Well, these systems have to have an aim, and from our perspective, that aim comes from the portfolio. And at the portfolio level, we have a body called the Program Portfolio Management, which is not necessarily, it could be a team, it could not be a team, it could be a group of cooperative stakeholders who have responsibility for investment spend. And they determine how the spend gets allocated to the release trains. And we also have a system for them because big things happen at the portfolio level. big things like migrate to a new web server or 64-bit back office servers, or one of the biggest I was involved in was to basically deploy a common UI framework across, a series of over 100 mobile devices. Okay, well, that's a really big deal. And that has to be reasoned about, it has to be thought about, it has to be estimated, and it has to be done with some care. So the portfolio Kanban system is the place where those big initiatives go. They get work in process limited, and they move through various states of maturity until they get to implementation. And we use the word epics to describe the business epics and the architectural epics. Single sign-on, that would be a business epic. Move to 64-bit back office servers, that'd be an architectural epic. Their architecture is a first-class citizen in this model. We don't know how to build really large-scale systems with solely emergent design. We have a lot of principles and philosophies around emergent design and intentional architecture and how they work together. We respect emergent design at the team level, but we also recognize that 20 teams each creating their own instance and protocol for single sign-on is probably not a great plan. So we do provide this level of governance at the portfolio level because that's where the spend comes from. That's where the benefit really comes to as well. However, like a lot of things, everything changes with Lean and Agile at scale. And our existing PMO organizations and PPM organizations probably have encoded and embedded waterfall development. And as such, that means they're regulating us to do waterfall. Well, that doesn't really work. Well, ask yourself a question. Who taught these people that? We did. Who's going to teach them the new way of working? We are. Here's a secret. The primary challenge associated with implementing Lean and Agile at scale is one of management education and management training. So built into SAFE is an understanding that every stakeholder, manager, leader that hangs around software teams needs to understand the new way of working, the leaner and more agile way of working. And that translates to the portfolio as well. And here you see a set of practices that have real depth in SAFE, how you do demand management and achieve continuous value flow. And what's the result of all of that? Well, winning is more fun, okay? We have, I think, 10, 11 documented case studies on the web. They're all attributed. They all have quantitative data. I think some have some subjective data with respect to certain practices. Fun things. Greatest thing Mitchell has done in my 14 years here, 44% decrease in post-release defects. Happy project sponsors, happy teams, 50% cost to deliver reduction, 6 times increase in frequency of delivery. These are the empirical measures customers are getting with SAFE. I don't care to really argue the method. I like to look at the empirical results. And if Agile is about empirical feedback, we have a really agile process here. John Deere, after their big launch, the first year, warranty expense related to software was down 50% year over year. I had somebody push back on that someday and say, well, maybe that's just because you measured it, it went down. John Deere has been building plows since 1867. I'm confident they can measure their warranty expense. And I'm confident when they say it went down 50%, that it went down 50%. And employee engagement went up 9.8%. A critic looked at that and said, well, what if you'd had a model that it could have gone up 50%? I said, well, that'd be really hard there because that's actually a pretty cool company to work at. Their employee engagement was in the high 80s before they headed down this path. So this was a huge help to that team. And there's more. I won't go through them. Here's one from Outsourcing. And the last thought I want to leave you with is in your enterprise or in your customer's enterprise, who owns this problem, right? I mentioned earlier that our fundamental belief, the manifesto supports that too, right? Hire motivated individuals, give them the resources they need to get the job done. Deming said the workers will always do their best, no matter what system there is, the system they're in. Well, who can change the system? Well, only we can. You can. You and your customers' managers. And it's not enough that they commit themselves to quality and productivity. It's not enough to have a sign. They must know what it is they must do. So our view of that is this really is an education challenge, right? The teams are being educated to Agile, but managers aren't. Heck, they're largely excluded from the party. the only words you typically see associated with management in traditional kind of, fundamental Agile circuits are pejoratives. That does not scale. So we believe that the training issue is to train these lean thinking manager teachers, and every rollout we're involved in, every one of those statistics that I showed you there was a model whereby we had the opportunity, demanded, that first we change management we teach management the new way of working. And when you do that, they get great results. So wrapping all the way back to the principles of Lean and the difference, the foundation of Lean is leadership. That's us, the leaders and managers. The responsibility for successful implementation of the Scaled Agile Framework belongs with the managers and the leaders of the enterprise. The teams have their model. It's fantastic. It's Scrum, it's XP, it's Kanban. We have training for them, but we hold the keys to the cookie jar, and we have to be retrained as well. So thank you for your time. That is the end of the extremely unpleasant from my end one-way dialogue, and I'm pretty sure we're going to have some questions, and now I get to look at Jennifer and smile and wrap this up in the next 10 minutes or so.
Oh, thank you, Dean. First, I wanted to acknowledge this amazing community out there. There were about 140 people on here at one point, and they're starting to ask questions, and of course I said, well, we'll answer at the end, and then the community just jumped in and started to do their own self-organizing, empowered thing and answering the questions on behalf of...
That's the answer.
Yeah, so some of those questions I am going to leave to the community, but I am going to go through kind of top-down because there were some really great questions here, and here's one that came in from Chris. How do we reconcile the Agile approach for this constant kind of demand for road mapping and forward resource mapping that we always get in the enterprise when we're in a public-facing world?
Okay, so let me give you two extremes that don't work. It doesn't work to say we're Agile now, we're going to ship the coolest thing we can next, and we have no accountability for schedule or plan. Well, okay, here's another extreme that doesn't work. We planned the 2015 release of the John Deere Combine, and every software feature is defined at the software requirement specification level, and we're going to take that thing and deliver that. It doesn't work either. So SAFe has two important elements here, vision and roadmap. And the roadmap is the piece that allows us to basically take the marquee features and start making projections. So if you can still see my screen here, what you're looking at is basically a blow-up of our discussion of, in this case, basically a 3 PSI roadmap. The first PSI is committed. There are some stretch goals that aren't committed. The second PSI is forecast, and the third one is please destroy this slide after you read it. Okay. So we try to provide at least a 4 to 6 month planning horizon for what we describe as marquee features, the big MVPs. Without much detail below that, because all that detail will hurt you.
That makes sense, Dean, because what do you think happens? Do you think the market may change?
Well, the whole point is, I tell executives every day, I said, every long-term commitment you make decreases your agility as an enterprise. And they go, what? I said, well, you've just made a commitment, right? So you have to do that. So you can't decide to not do that. So if another customer comes along and says, please do this instead, you have to say no. So those long-term commitments basically hurt you. At the same time, inability to forecast, inability to show a roadmap that gives customers features, inability to predict some reasonable outcomes is also a death knell. So we just have to back off of what we know didn't work, highly detailed long-range planning. We have to also back off of what we know can't be sold, which is my teams are Agile, they're working on the right set of user stories, you'll see them where you'll see them, and we have to come back to this middle land with reasonable forecasts from credible teams, created by the teams themselves, and with those teams dedicated to meeting those goals.
That's great. So we had one from an Agilist. She's asking a few questions out here, but one is, the value of Agile is really great, but human beings work in waves of creativity, not a constant speed like being on a treadmill. So how do we deal with that in a Scaled Agile environment?
So that is a really brilliant question. Okay, and let me talk a little bit in philosophy. I'm very passionate about my work. I'm passionate about this team's work with the framework, but I'm not ideological about it. I'm not emotional about it. And the reason is that all models, XP, Scrum, and SAFe, are optimized for certain types of things. Agile is optimized with its time boxes for delivering value on largely extant architectures. That's what it's optimized for. That's what it's optimized for. That's just a fact. So I look at that and go, well, okay, that's what that's optimized for. That's a tyranny of the urgent. So I sat on a podium the other day where a company had, and I thought this was pretty aggressive. They actually did two 2-week sprints and a 2-week hardening and innovation sprint. So they would sprint twice, clean off their desks, and what they said was our teams love that because sprinting is really hard work, and you can't really take much risk in a sprint, no matter what you say, because the commitments get made to the sprint objective. So SAFe actually calls out a pattern of 4+1. And the fifth sprint is hardening, innovation, and planning, and that allows planning to occur on cadence. You have to catch your breath. You have to clean your desk. You have to refactor code. You have to stop and do innovative spikes that are pretty hard to do in real time. So we build as much of that innovation as we can into the model because Scrum is the tyranny of the urgent, make no mistake about it. Sprint 0 followed by Sprint 73, 74, 75.
That's fantastic because we're really not building the software. We're really building the people that build the software, and we need to allow time for them to gain the knowledge
Absolutely.
and creativity.
And then on the architecture side, if you take an XP view, the faster you implement features, the faster you burn up the existing architecture. So you have to have some architectural runway, which is this kind of red box in the middle that says, well, we've got enough architecture for now, right? The next PSI or two. But we may not have enough for later, so we need to build some more.
That's great. That leads right into another question that's pretty directed. So I'd be interested in hearing about how to scale the Agile architecture design in an Agile just-in-time fashion, in particular regarding infrastructure and solution design.
That's a deep question. I'm going to point, I think, to our best guidance on the topic, and also by definition show that we have guidance. So not every discussion here is strictly related to an icon. A few years back, I sat down with a number of really bright people, systems architects. Being a capable system architect does not mean that by definition you don't understand Agile development. Many of them do. And if you look at some of the people, Jennifer's nodding because she's met these people too. If you look at these sharp architects who know that waterfall thing is kind of hosing them, these are people you can learn from. So we sat down with those guys and invented and brainstormed a set of principles that we thought would really be the right type of guidance, right? Because you can't go to the Agile Manifesto for that. You can't go to the XP books and talk about architecture. So you see here 7 principles. First one is design does emerge. Architecture is a collaboration. And there's a discussion of what we mean by those things. And we talk about architectural runway and a whole variety of principles. So I can't answer that one in 1 minute. I can say there's a set of guiding principles for where emergent design touches intentional architecture and how architectural runway gets extended with just enough visibility to allow us to support future features, but without attempting to future-proof the thing. So again, it's a sense of balance, right? It's a pragmatic balance between letting design emerge at the team level because they have all the local context, but making sure that those designs are steered so that you can build a thing that has conceptual integrity.
Yeah. So Millard actually captured your thoughts here. He said the faster you deliver features, the faster you burn up that existing architecture.
Absolutely. And so we talked to our teams then. The waterfall got most of us here. And I remember doing waterfall development, and I remember that time where you'd have 3 or 4 months to figure out how to build this thing. This is a semi-private audience. Don't you kind of miss that? Okay, well, we don't have that anymore. So when do we reason about architecture? When do we refactor the underlying system? When do we build the frameworks and the stubs that we need to allow us to kind of rototill the existing architecture while we're still selling product? And the answer is every dang day. So architecture is basically a parsed up, split set of thoughts, managed, I think, conceptually somewhat independently from the sprint cadence, but aligned primarily to the PSI cadence. So, it's a pretty simple discovery. Good programs will blow PSIs, And when you do virtually every time, it's because they had to put in some new architecture. And we talk about when we talk about architectural runway, by the way, that's code. That's not a model. That says I already have sufficient table space to do that. I have my protocol already supports that, or I could simply amend my protocol versus no, I need to rethink and establish a whole new protocol. So architectural runway is code. Intentional architecture, those are models and plans. It's okay to model in Agile. We do it ourselves. You know, we have a small shop, 4 or 5 people building a pretty cool thing. There are models on the whiteboards that show us what we think we're building. There's a domain model. If you look at the big picture here and think about modeling for a second and say, what is this thing? The big picture is a domain model of the Scaled Agile Framework. And if I took that picture away and started talking about all the attributes and the cool stuff in the Scaled Agile Framework, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because this is what allows people to reason about the framework, rightly or wrongly, badly, good, whatever they want to do, they can do it from here. How do you do that about a system? And this is just text, a little bit of code. How do you think about a large-scale system without some representation for the way the system works at a level of abstraction that you can have a sensible conversation?
That's great. So I think I want to spend the last 4 minutes talking about the portfolio level, because we have some good questions here. One from Rolf: do the WIP limits at the top level attempt to avoid the overcommitment of capabilities by senior management?
Absolutely. And the WIP limits, so the portfolio Kanban system was invented at a company called F-Secure in Finland, who I was coaching through Agile, a really, really good company, really an Agile company and Agile architects, but who had made a series of plans based upon the CTO's view of what could be accomplished and committed to those plans to the outside world. And when we brought those plans in and started vetting them with the teams and realized that the teams had essentially no capacity for new work because they were being eaten alive in the marketplace at the time, we looked at those plans. Those plans were probably a 4 to 5 year roadmap that the CTO had predicted would be done in a year. You don't want to do that, okay? That's really bad. And those are really smart people. And the reason was they couldn't see that work. They couldn't see what he had in his mind. It hadn't been reasoned about. So if you go to this Kanban system here, we'll go to the architecture Kanban system because we're talking to probably a bunch of architects as well, and start looking at the way that works. Those work and process limits are designed to make sure that you don't spend any time analyzing things you can't do, and that you only bring things into the system where you have capacity to execute.
Brilliant. So the last one actually is probably going to take a little longer than 2 minutes, but I thought I'd throw it out there and see if you could give some guidance. Can you provide any recommendations for identifying and defining value streams?
So our training does, okay? But it depends very much on the context of the business. If you were working in embedded systems, then you're typically looking for new types of capabilities, right? What new capabilities? Maybe if I'm in the contractor world, machine-to-machine communication, right? I'm going to have a whole value stream oriented on that. Or guidance, crop care, and documentation. If you're working in products, the value streams are typically SKUs, and you design them around them. If you're building in IT, you're looking for basically the initiatives that support the KPIs of the executive team. So there's no short course to determining what the value streams are, but there's a lot of coaching and counseling. And also, please avoid armchair quarterbacking what the value streams are. That's a reasoned analysis process, and it has to happen before you start deploying SAFe.
Well, there's 1 minute left, so I'm going to throw one more out there. Does SAFe provide recommendations on how to deal with requirements and how epics are gathered and validated and how they're split into features and benefits and user stories?
Absolutely does. If we look at, let's just look at epics here and see what we have. There's basically a way to express an epic, a lightweight business case for an epic, and then I thought splitting was there, but I think splitting must occur over here. This is, so I've totally lost where splitting epics is here. But there's guidance for splitting epics, splitting features, and splitting stories in SAFe.
Fantastic. So refer to the framework. So I wanted to thank the community at large again. Most everybody stayed the entire hour, so thank you. Yes, this will be posted.
And to answer that last question, splitting epics can be found under Business Epic.
Oh, great. You're fast with the fingers. So this will be posted. I'm going to turn this back to JL to wrap it up.
Thank you. So there's still a couple of questions that have not been answered. So what I will do after the call today, I will post those questions on the community, the DevOps community, and people can also post additional questions later on. And this way, we will be able to provide answers to everyone. So Dean and Jennifer, thanks a lot for your time today. It was very interesting, and I'm sure the community, the DevOps community, will benefit a lot from this webinar. It will be posted and shared on the Developer Works community, so people can use the replay. And thanks a lot for your time today, and I hope we're going to... Thanks, no problem. Hope we're going to have additional technical webinars all together pretty soon.
That'd be great. Thanks again, JL.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye, everybody.